kind of a spread in the middle, describing how the different groups actually moved against one another in 4 or 5 steps. So it's really a fascinating book. But I ran through these and I just picked out a couple of, I wanted to see how often in these battles were people who, you know, had the greater numbers, were they defeated. And I picked out a couple here. In the Battle of Arsuf in 1191, you had, this is I think in Turkey, you have 12,000 Crusaders going up against 20,000 Saracens under the, maybe you've heard the name Saladin. Saladin, I don't know how you pronounce it. But as it turns out, the 12,000 Crusaders beat the 20,000 Saracens. Okay, so those are numbers close to our own numbers. We're talking 10,000 to 20,000. I want to give you a few more, couple more examples. Bannockburn in Scotland, 1314. You have 19,000 Scots fighting off 18,000 Englishmen, which they do successfully. So here's our 2-to-1 ratio. So again, just because you're outnumbered 2-to-1 doesn't mean you're going to get defeated. It just means you've got to really be careful with what you're doing. There's a couple fun ones about the English beating the French. You're probably familiar with the Battle of Agincourt, where this is in 1450. You have 5,700 English bowmen and spearmen against a French army of 25,000. Wow. So you've got 5,700 against 25,000. So the English, they kind of taunt the French as they did for like thousands of years. They kind of provoke the French and they bring them up into a little kind of a meadow between 2 forests so that they kind of bottleneck. And the way they bottleneck them, it ends up being, you know, the 5,000 Englishmen spread out against whatever they can bottleneck in, and they basically just shatter this force of 25,000 people and send them on their way. And again, going to show that it's not necessarily a numbers game, it's really a brains game. It's really a contemplation game. It's really a game of, you know, do I understand what I'm getting myself into, and can I really think through how this works? But again, isn't that what discipleship is? And I think that's the point he's making. Listen, you're going to feel like you're outnumbered, but that fact of being outnumbered doesn't mean you've lost the battle. It just means you've got to be smart. You've got to make a decision carefully. You've got to decide if this is really what you want to do.
And make a battle plan.
Yes, and make a battle plan. And stick to that battle plan and persevere. And make sure you're not just following. You know, it drives me crazy, people who say Christians just follow mindlessly. And don't get me wrong, there's a lot of Christians that follow mindlessly. But I think Christianity is one of the most intellectually compelling forces on the planet, frankly. You know, you can read philosophy and all these other things, but there is something fascinating about learning more about Christianity. It is not at all about putting your brain at the door and just following the guy in front of you. It needs to be something that you contemplate and you understand, okay, what am I supposed to do? What does God want me to do next? And then I'm going to go ahead and do it. So, now the risk is high. Now there's 2 things I want to bring your attention to again that kind of bring the stakes up from the previous parable about the man building a building. The stakes are high. In the previous parable, the risk was ridicule. Okay, this guy was going to lose a lot of money, and there's going to be ridicule. In the parable of the king, what's the risk? 10,000 men that could get just wiped out. And, you know, for any person of that time period, a 10,000 person force was a pretty good force, but that's it. You know, it would take generations to recreate, to reproduce that kind of a fighting force. I mean, if you lose, you know, you've pretty much socially shot yourself in the foot in terms of your city-state, your region, your nation. So it's a pretty high risk. Now, notice verse 32, though. It says he will either send his 10,000 against these 20,000, or else while the other is still far away, he sends a delegation and asks for terms of peace. So this is implying that he wants to understand what decision to make before we start down a road that might not be a good idea. So the king needs to make an informed and a sensible decision about this fight in light of his resources, in light of the risks. And there's a variety of factors, that go into this. I mean, some of the factors that go into this is terrain. You know, can we win a 2 against 1 or a 1 against 2 battle in light of the terrain that's around us? What about the speed of your forces or the other forces? What about the competence of your opponent? He's not a very good tactician. We can get him. Okay, you got to take all. He has to sit down and take all of these factors into account. So what does he decide to do? What does the text say that he decides to do? It doesn't say.
He sends a delegation.
It really doesn't say. And we're kind of, well, what is it? Does he go to fight? Does he, what factors, what does he do? Well, what he does is not the point. That he stops and contemplates what would be the best thing to do before he does anything. I think that's the point. Which decision he makes is not as material and significant as the fact that he has to make an informed decision. Now, there's something else. There's another sense of urgency of this second parable relative to the first parable. What creates a sense of urgency to the second parable? He's got to make a decision. Why?
Because the enemy is approaching.
The enemy is coming. Okay, the first guy is building a building. He doesn't have any externally imposed time frame. He just, hey, I want to build a building. I think I can do it. He just does it. There's an additional sense of risk with this second parable. There's an additional sense of urgency. You have to make a decision because your window of decision is closing. And if you wait to make a decision, then you run out of decisions, essentially. Yes, sir?
Being part of the peace delegation wasn't a really great job. Josephus recounts a battle that he was involved in where they sent a peace emissary to him. They cut off his hand, hung it around his neck, and sent him back to where he came.
Yes. There's a lot of stories where the peace delegation is not received well. And that's not a fun job. It's kind of like being the king's cupbearer. It's going to be a potentially fatal job. So he's really in a serious position. This king has to make a decision one way or the other. And he might say, listen, I got to send the peace delegation out. There's just no way. They're going to come in. My opponent is an extremely capable strategist. They're going to come in and wipe us out.
There's something else that he needs to consider.
Yeah.
He needs to consider his troops. Are they passionate? Do they believe in the cause? And when the Scots beat the English at Bannockburn, that was a factor. The Scots' freedom was at stake.
Yes.
And the Englishmen, they were just there fighting. They didn't have an emotional or a faith or like we would have as Christians. We're emotionally invested in this battle. The Scots were poorly trained and poorly educated overall, but they had equipped, but they had the passion. They got it done, and they planned out what they were going to do in a way that they could overcome the better trained, better, higher number of opponents. So there's a lot to think through here, and what I think is interesting is Jesus isn't, we see in some places where Jesus comes up to Levi and said, leave all this behind and follow me, and he just almost, without thinking about it, follows Jesus. But there seem to be others that he wants to call out that he's saying, listen, you really need to think through what you're about to do before you follow. And then when you start to follow, you need to stick with it and not look back. So he needs to make a decision. This king needs to make a decision in light of imminent events, and this is the additional urgency.
Now think about what Christ may be communicating to people of that time. Okay, I'm not exactly sure where chronologically this is in Jesus' ministry, but he might be sending a signal to those who are sitting there listening, listen, the time is closing. I'm going to be crucified. I'm going to be taken off the scene. Certainly we can follow Christ after the ascension. That's the whole, after the resurrection and the ascension. That's what the rest of the New Testament is all about. But he seems to be saying there is a kind of a closing window where you can follow after Christ in a meaningful way. He seems to be saying that to those who are sitting there listening to him. And remember what he's using these parables to do. He's using these parables to chase away those people that are just kind of in it for the show, or in it for the free bread and fish, and aren't really interested in following Christ passionately. So he's trying to kind of separate these people out from one another, and in doing that, saying, listen, if you want to follow, you really need to make sure you know what you're doing. So for this king, there's a window of decision that is closing rapidly, and perhaps for Jesus' original audience. I suppose in some ways we could even think about discipleship in our own lives and say, sometimes we have windows of opportunity to follow Christ in a new, different, meaningful way, but those windows don't always stay open forever. Sometimes we feel like maybe Christ is moving us in a specific direction, and sometimes it's just kind of out there in the open. We can do that whenever we feel like we're ready and willing to follow, but not always. Sometimes those doors of opportunity that God provides for us can close quickly, and we need to be ready and willing and make sure that this is something we want to do in order to follow him in that level of discipleship. So that's basically that parable. I want to keep going through the rest of this passage, though, because we kind of get another little, I don't know if you want to call verses 34 and 35 a parable, as much as more of an analogy, but it's really fascinating. Again, he starts off in verse 26 with kind of almost a hyperbolic statement, and then in verse 27 he's using analogy. Then we have these two parables. The most clear thing that he says is in verse 33, which is an application of the parables, but then in verse 34 and 35 he gets back into an analogy, basically. So let's kind of pick it up in verse 33 here. And this is kind of an application of these parables. Verse 33, so then none of you can be my disciple who does not give up all his own possessions. Now what is interesting, I'll pass it here. Yeah, what is interesting here is at the beginning of verse 33, he has two words, utos un. These are both conjunctives that connect with the previous thought, and you don't have to use both of them. One of them would get the point across, either this one or that one, but he uses both of them, both utas and un, because he's trying to say, listen, now I'm going to tell you something, but it connects with what I've been saying to you. And the NASB says, so then. I think we could even be more powerful than that and say, okay, here's the bottom line, folks, based on what I've been telling you. And he says, none of you can be my disciple who does not give up all his own possessions. The word, and this is a critical word, the word to give up is the word apatasomai. It means, literally, it means to say goodbye to something. And it is used, as you can't see on the screen there, it is used, technology, it is used several places. I got Mark, Luke, a couple times in Luke, once or twice in Acts. Every other time it is used in the New Testament, it is two people who are separating from one another and they're saying goodbye. I'm not sure exactly how you get that across in English, but the idea of to give up, I think it's the sense of someone who does not make a definitive detachment from his possessions. I'm trying not to just be materialistic about this and think, well, I like my possessions, I don't want to give them up. But I'm also trying to be realistic and think,